Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are getting into the philosophy of Friedrich Nietzsche, a thinker who I think it's fair to say built his reputation on contradiction.
That's putting it mildly.
We're specifically going to be tracking his really tumultuous relationship with the concept of truth itself. I mean, if you've ever read Nietzsche, you know this is the man who gave us God is dead, but also it seems the idea that truth itself is just impossible.
And that tension it's everything. It's the defining feature of how people have read him for a century. How could one of the most influential thinkers, of modern times be taken seriously if he's rejecting the very possibility of knowledge?
Right.
Our sources, especially Maudemarie Clark's analysis, really argue that this common view that Nietzsche was just a nihilist who rejected all truth it's a huge oversimplification.
And that's our mission for this deep dive. We're going to track the subtle but, seismic shift in his thinking, the journey from an early, really radical denial of truth.
A denial based on a flawed premise, it's important to say.
Right. From that to a much more coherent, mature position that actually affirms truth. Just not in the way that traditional philosophy had ever defined it.
To really get the stakes here,
Yeah.
we have to start with those early claims, the really provocative ones that just cemented his reputation, the kinds of statements that make you question everything.
Oh, yeah. Right out of the gate, you get him saying, truths are illusions we have forgotten are illusions. I mean, if that doesn't sound nihilistic, what does?
Exactly. Or think about this one, about the utility of our own concepts. Truth is the kind of error without which a certain kind of being could not live.
So truth isn't just false, it's a necessary lie that we need to survive.
A life-sustaining lie. And then, of course, the big one that you hear everywhere in postmodern thought. There are no facts, but only interpretations.
Okay, so that's the central problem, the intellectual challenge. How does he argue so powerfully against metaphysics, morality, all these things, arguments that demand incredible intellectual honesty?
If he truly believes it's all just arbitrary error. Exactly. Clark's point is that he wasn't rejecting the simple necessity of a fact. He was rejecting a crushing, completely unattainable standard for what truth had to be.
Okay, let's unpack that. If he's rejecting a standard, we need to define it. It all boils down to the correspondence theory, right? A statement is true if it corresponds to reality.
Yes, but this is the crucial distinction. This is the bedrock of his whole evolution. There are two totally different ways to think about that correspondence.
So there's a version he had to accept and another version that got him into all this trouble.
Precisely. On one hand, you have what we can call minimal correspondence. This is just common sense truth.
Like snow is white is true if and only if snow is actually white.
That's the one. It only requires what philosophers call ontological realism, which is just a fancy way of saying
that the world exists outside of my head. The table is there even when I'm not looking at it.
Exactly. And the text makes it clear that to reject that is to reject logic, shared language, everything. And Nietzsche, even at his most radical, couldn't really go there later in his life.
But then you have the trap, the second version, the metaphysical correspondence theory.
This is the one that caught him. It takes that simple idea of correspondence and it bolts on this impossible condition, metaphysical realism.
Okay, what does that mean?
It means a statement is only true if it corresponds to reality as it is in itself.
So let's follow that proof. This comes from his early essay on Truth and Lie, where he argues that human knowledge has to falsify reality. How does he build that chain of distortion?
He describes knowledge as this layered process of metaphor. It's all based on a representational theory of perception that was popular then. There are two key layers, and the second representation enters the picture. Truth is already lost.
Okay, so what's the first layer?
The first metaphor. It happens inside you. A physical stimulus light from an object hitting your eye is transferred and becomes a subjective image, a percept. It's not the thing itself. It's already a translation.
So we've gone from a physical input to a totally different thing, a subjective feeling. That's step one away from the thing in itself.
And then comes the second metaphor, language. That internal subjective image is then imitated by a sound, a word like tree.
I love the analogy he uses here.
That's a fantastic one. He says the whole process is like a deaf person trying to understand sound by only looking at the patterns it makes in sound. The Clandy figures.
It makes the failure so clear. The deaf person sees the effect, the trace, but never the vibration itself. And we're the same. We never get the original essence, just the word, which is a representation of the image, which is a representation of the nerve impulse.
And if that wasn't bad enough, concepts are born from that process. A concept for him is formed by, quote, arbitrarily discarding individual differences. When you create the concept leaf, you have to deliberately forget that every single leaf is unique.
You're equating unequal things.
You're forcing an equation. It's a willful denial of the specific for the sake of having a useful category. So because our whole intellectual structure, perception, language, concepts is built on this chain of flawed representation.
Early Nietzsche felt totally justified in saying that all our claims are just socially useful illusions. They fail to connect to that transcendent reality, so they're not true.
And this is where we get to the turning point, the big one, the moment of self-correction that really defines his mature philosophy.
If the problem is the impossible standard.
The only solution is to destroy the standard itself.
Right, and that's him rejecting the whole idea of the thing in itself. His later works just throw it out completely. He calls it a contradictory impossibility.
And I think a lot of people might ask, wait, how can a philosopher just do that? Isn't Kant's thing in itself a foundational concept?
It sounds like a convenient way to get out of a intellectual corner he backed himself into.
Well, for Nietzsche, it's about logical coherence. The concept is incoherent because you can't, by definition, conceive of something that is independent of all possible ways of conceiving. The very act of naming it, the unknowable X, is already putting a human conceptual framework on it. It's just an empty phrase.
So if that's gone, if the true world is abolished, what happens to the world we're left with? The world of our senses?
It's immediately validated. You can't call it illusory anymore. You only call something an illusion if you have a realer reality to compare it to. Once that superior reality is gone,
the remaining world is just reality.
it's just the world. And you can see him work this out in Twilight of the Idols in that amazing section, how the true world finally became a fable.
That's his own narrative of self-correction.
It is. He tracks the 6 stages of this great error, and it culminates in stage 6, where the metaphysical world is finally eliminated. And the consequence he draws is just brilliant. He says, we have abolished the true world. What world remains? Perhaps the apparent world. No. With the true world, we have also abolished the apparent world.
It stops being the apparent world because there's nothing for it to be contrasted with. It just is.
And that's why his later works, I mean, the Antichrist, T.I., they all show this, this unambiguous respect for facts, for the senses, for science. He's affirming empirical truth, that minimal correspondence we talked about.
He's actively separating himself from anyone still basing knowledge on non-empirical stuff.
He dismisses them. He calls their ideas miscarriage and not yet science.
Okay, so he's cleared the deck. He affirms empirical facts. But this leaves us with his most famous mature doctrine, perspectivism. If he accepts facts, what on earth does it mean to say that all knowledge is perspectival? Is he still saying the facts change depending on who's looking?
No, and that's the common mistake. The facts don't change, but our access to them is always conditioned. Perspectivism is the idea that knowledge is always viewed through a lens.
A lens made of our biases, our needs, our interests.
Exactly. Our beliefs, our cognitive capacities, our practical goals. It's really a rejection of the idea of pure reason. You know, the idea that you could somehow strip away all human influence and get this absolute divine view. He called non-perspectival seeing an absurdity and a nonsense.
So a statement can be true from our perspective, and the fact that we don't have a God's eye view doesn't make that truth an illusion.
Correct. We affirm the truth we discover, but we recognize that how we frame it, how we value it, is inherently human.
This is where it gets really intense, because he connects this whole philosophical journey back to a radical moral critique. His analysis of the will to truth as the latest form of the ascetic ideal.
And this connection is devastating. First, you have to understand the ascetic ideal. For Nietzsche, it's a will to nothingness. It's a life-devaluing principle that praises self-denial, suffering, and turning away from the passions, all for some higher transcendent world.
The ideal of the priest, the monk.
Right. But Nietzsche argues in Gnostikon, the genealogy of morals, that once God is dead, this ideal doesn't just disappear. The unconditional dogmatic faith in truth at any price, the absolute ruthless drive for knowledge you see in the modern, godless scientist or philosopher, that becomes the latest, most spiritual expression of that same old ascetic ideal.
Okay, wait, you have to stop me there. That feels completely backward. How can intellectual honesty and scientific rigor be a form of the will against life? It seems like the opposite of a monk denying himself.
Because of the cost, the incredible self-denial involved. Nietzsche says it takes as much ascetic virtue as any denial of sensuality. Why? Because the modern truth seeker has to sacrifice all of humanity's most comforting beliefs.
Belief in God, in a hidden purpose, in cosmic justice.
All of it. They sacrifice meaning for verifiable fact. They choose intellectual loneliness over psychological comfort. And this unconditional rigor, this willingness to burn down every comforting belief in the name of truth, is an act of profound self-cruelty. It's the pure, modern kernel of the life-denying ascetic ideal.
So the very people who thought they were rebels tearing down the old system
The honest atheists, the rigorous scientists.
were actually just continuing the same psychological structure of self-denial. They just swapped physical sacrifice for intellectual sacrifice.
Precisely. And that leads to the crisis. Once the will to truth, through its own rigorous honesty, discovers the truth about itself, that it rests on this anti-life foundation, it has to logically overcome itself. The quest for truth has destroyed its own moral justification.
And if that old life-denying ideal is gone, a new life-affirming ideal has to be created to take its place. And that brings us to his famous counter-ideal, eternal recurrence.
Yes, his fundamental conception. But our source, Clark, is really clear that this should be seen as a psychological test, an ethical ideal, not as a literal theory about the cosmos. It's the direct answer to the self-resentment of the ascetic ideal.
Let's lay out the thought experiment from the gay science, the demon's test. And you, listening, should really put yourself in this position. Imagine a demon appears in your loneliest moment.
And this demon tells you that you have to relive your entire life exactly as it is now. Every joy, every pain, every tiny thought, an infinite number of times. Nothing will ever change.
Your reaction is the test. It's the measure of your affirmation of life.
If you despair, if you curse the demon, then you are still resentful of time, of suffering, of existence itself. You're still trapped by the ascetic ideal, which always wishes for a different, better, purer world.
But if you could respond with joy, with an ecstatic yes and amen, if you could desire this infinite repetition, then you've achieved it. You've overcome that resentment and can affirm life completely just as it is.
The goal of the ideal is to live in such a way that you would want it all to come back. And that requires overcoming the philosophical resentment toward existence that made the ascetic ideal seem necessary in the first place.
And a quick final note on his other famous doctrine, the will to power. If he's rejecting metaphysics, why propose this cosmology where the world is just struggling quanta force? Isn't that a new metaphysical truth claim?
It's often read that way, but Clark argues that given his mature philosophy, the will to power is best understood as a construction, a working hypothesis. It's his attempt to interpret the world in the image of his new life-affirming values as a counter-interpretation to the life-devaluing ones that came before.
So it's a tool for revaluation, not a statement of fact about ultimate reality.
Exactly.
That makes so much more sense. He realized empirical truth must be affirmed, but the motivation for seeking truth, that has to be re-examined and revalued.
Precisely. He shed the impossible metaphysical standard, which let him affirm the world of the senses. But then he found that the moral fervor behind that pursuit, the will to truth, was the last, purest expression of the self-destructive ascetic ideal.
So the ultimate lesson is that this incredible intellectual honesty, the kind that tears down every comfort, it leaves us in a kind of moral and psychological void, and it forces us to create a new, life-affirming purpose for seeking knowledge.
Which brings us to the final provocative question for you, the listener. Even if we are, godless anti-metaphysicians who embrace scientific rigor, we have to face Nietzsche's discovery that our unconditional commitment to truth at any price is still a powerful residue of that self-denying ascetic ideal.
So if that's true,
what is the new value? The new ideal one, built not on self-denial but on affirmation and joy. In whose service should we pursue knowledge now that the old ascetic foundations have been kicked out from under us?
that's the challenge that remains after the idols have been smashed. A question to ponder as you look toward your next deep dive. Thank you for joining us.